Richard Hayes, a divorced businessman known for his cold demeanor, stunned everyone present when he walked into London's most exclusive restaurant accompanied by Clara, his housekeeper. Conversations halted, curious gazes turned to the unlikely pair, and the room, once brimming with confidence and opulence, fell into an awkward silence. He seemed unfazed by the murmurs around him, but Clara, visibly uneasy, clutched her handbag tightly as though she wished to disappear. What no one knew, not even her, was that this evening would change their lives forever. 2 days prior to the dinner, Richard had been seated in his leather armchair in the minimalist office of his penthouse. A gilded invitation lay on the glass table before him, both flashy and oppressive. "Attendance mandatory," read the accompanying note. The host, Charles Beaumont, was one of the city's most influential tycoons, and his endorsement was a golden ticket to the exclusive circle of global investors. But Richard didn't feel up to it. Since his divorce, his personal life had quietly descended into chaos. His home echoed with emptiness, his schedule was packed with soulless meetings, and his flawless suit masked a man exhausted from pretending everything was under control. That morning, as Clara wiped down the dining table, he observed her in silence. Always efficient, she seemed strangely oblivious to his inner turmoil. She was the opposite of what the world expected at an event like that: simple, genuine, unpretentious. And in that moment, an absurd idea occurred to him. "Clara," he called, his deep voice cutting through the hum of the vacuum cleaner. "Are you busy Thursday evening?" She turned to him, surprised, setting the cloth aside. "No, Mr. Hayes." "Why? Would you join me for a business dinner?" The silence hung between them. Clara blinked a few times, baffled, before cautiously responding, "Me? At the dinner? But why?" Richard didn't have a concrete answer. "Because I think you could help me." And so, without further explanation, preparations began for the night that would change them both forever. Clara stood frozen, holding the damp cloth in her hands, unsure if she'd just heard a joke or some kind of mistake. Yet Richard's gaze remained steady. He looked so serious that the idea of refusing didn't even cross her mind. "If that's what you need, yes, I can go," she replied hesitantly, unable to hide the doubt in her voice. Richard nodded, but his expression showed no relief. He offered no further explanation, turning his attention back to the laptop on his desk. For Clara, the conversation lingered in the air like a riddle. Why on earth would he choose her, of all people? The next day, the atmosphere in the house shifted. Richard seemed restless, pacing back and forth, checking messages on his phone. Clara carried on with her usual tasks, but felt the weight of his gaze more than usual. "Clara," he called suddenly in the middle of the morning. She appeared at the office door, rubbing her hands to rid them of the smell of detergent. "Yes, Mr. Hayes? Do you have anything suitable to wear to this dinner?" The question was as direct as it was uncomfortable. Her eyes widened in surprise. No, I don't think so. My dresses are quite simple." He ran a hand over his chin, as if making an important decision. "Then go and buy a dress. Something appropriate. The dinner is at La Maison." Clara nearly choked at the mention of the name. La Maison was legendary in London, known for hosting the elite in its luxurious setting, with prices that could make anyone's eyes water. "Mr. Hayes, that's not necessary. I could wear." "Don't argue. I'll arrange it." He was already on the phone before she could finish. That afternoon, Richard insisted Clara be accompanied by a stylist he had hired. When she returned with the dress in hand, Richard gave it a quick glance but said nothing. Clara, however, was visibly uncomfortable with what she considered to be an overwhelming gesture. Meanwhile, Richard wrestled with his own insecurities. He spent hours mentally rehearsing conversations he might have at the dinner, going over figures, strategies, and ways to impress Charles Beaumont without coming across as desperate. Yet Clara's presence intrigued him. Why had he chosen her? Perhaps it was an unconscious gesture, a way of reminding himself that not everything had to be a display of power and status. That night, well past his usual bedtime, Richard wandered down to the kitchen for a coffee. To his surprise, Clara was still there, tidying up the pantry. "Are you nervous?" he asked. She stopped what she was doing, meeting his gaze with a straightforward honesty. "A bit. I don't think I belong in a place like that. I wouldn't know what to say, how to act." For the first time in days, Richard smiled. It was tired but genuine. "You don't need to say anything. Just be yourself." Clara hesitated before replying, noticing a weariness in his eyes she hadn't seen before. "And you? Are you nervous?" Richard looked away, his eyes dropping to the floor. "More than I'd like to admit." Those simple words broke an invisible barrier between them. For a fleeting moment, the businessman and his housekeeper didn't seem so different, just two people trying to find some sense of footing in a world that felt out of reach. The next morning, Clara arrived at Richard's house earlier than usual. There was something different in the air, though she couldn't quite put her finger on it. The day before had felt surreal, the expensive dress, the stylist, and now the looming reality of stepping into a world far outside her comfort zone. She tried to act as if everything was normal, but her nerves betrayed her. Richard, on the other hand, seemed more on edge than ever. He barely slept, and the pile of papers scattered across his desk bore testament to the hours he'd spent refining business strategies to impress Charles Beaumont. Yet his thoughts kept drifting back to Clara. He couldn't decide if bringing his housekeeper was a quiet act of defiance against societal expectations or a desperate attempt to reconnect with values he'd lost somewhere along the way. "Clara," he called from the living room as she adjusted the cushions on the sofa. "Yes, Mr. Hayes? I've arranged for a hairdresser to come by tomorrow afternoon. You'll need a proper hairstyle for the dinner." She frowned, setting the cushion down. "Sir, I really don't think that's necessary. I could do something simple." He shook his head, cutting her off. "Necessary or not, it's important. Just go with it, please." Clara didn't argue, but as she returned to her work, the weight of what lay ahead pressed down on her. Every little detail seemed to highlight the gulf between their worlds. As she cleaned the windows in the sitting room, her mind wandered. What would she say at the dinner? What if she made a mistake? That afternoon, Richard took an unusual step for him. He personally drove Clara into the city. Despite his usual no-nonsense demeanor, there was an almost human quality in the way he explained what needed to be done. "You need to be prepared. They'll notice everything. These are the sort of people who scrutinize every detail." Clara swallowed hard, nodding as they stepped out of the car in front of a high-end salon. She stared at the mirrored windows, already feeling out of place. "Mr. Hayes, this is too much," she said, hesitating at the door. "You can call me Richard. And please, just trust me. I don't want this to be a disaster." Reluctantly, she stepped inside and spent the next several hours moving between treatments, the hairdresser's instructions, and a crash course in basic etiquette. Richard stayed close, more like a manager overseeing a project than a companion. To him, it was a stark reminder of how hollow his life had become, filled with appearances and protocols. By the time they returned home, Clara was exhausted, but something had shifted. The dress, the hairstyle, the new shoes, they transformed her into someone she barely recognized. As she passed down the hallway, she caught sight of herself in the mirror and paused. The reflection staring back at her didn't look like the Clara she knew. The morning of the dinner arrived, and the tension was palpable. Richard was absorbed in finalizing his notes, rehearsing his lines, and double-checking every logistical detail. Clara, on the other hand, busied herself in the kitchen, trying to keep her mind off what was ahead. But every time she glanced at the clock, her heart raced a little faster. By early afternoon, Richard appeared in the kitchen. He was dressed in a dark, perfectly tailored suit, but for the first time in years, Clara noticed that he looked more weary than commanding. "Are you ready?" he asked, his expression a mix of anticipation and unease. She took a deep breath and nodded. "I'm ready. I hope I don't let you down." Richard hesitated before replying. "There's nothing you could do that would be worse than the mistakes I've already made. Just trust me." When the car arrived to collect them, Clara clutched her bag tightly, trying to convince herself she was prepared to face something far bigger than she had imagined. For Richard, however, the dinner wasn't just a business opportunity, it was a test for something he couldn't quite define. The black car glided smoothly to the entrance of La Maison, where a red carpet welcomed the guests. Clara peered out of the window, her stomach churning. Elegantly dressed men and women exchanged quiet conversation while impeccably dressed waiters carried trays of crystal glasses. "We're here," Richard said, breaking the silence. He adjusted his watch, a nervous tick she had noticed before. As the valet opened the car door, Richard stepped out first, offering her a steady hand to help her down. The moment Clara stepped onto the carpet, she felt the weight of stairs burning into her. It wasn't just surprise at seeing her there, it was the thinly veiled curiosity of an audience used to dissecting every move of anyone who dared enter their world. "Let's go," Richard murmured, guiding her towards the entrance. His face remained impassive, as if indifferent to the opinions of others, but Clara could feel the tension in his fingers as he held her hand. The main hall was breathtaking, illuminated by enormous crystal chandeliers that cast a golden glow over the walls. The tables were arranged with flawless precision, and the air was filled with the scent of sophisticated cuisine. Clara barely had time to take in the grandeur before being introduced to the first group of guests. "Charles!" Richard exclaimed, his tone bordering on overly cordial. A gray-haired man with piercing eyes turned towards them, a calculated smile on his lips. "Richard," Charles replied, shaking his hand firmly. His gaze quickly shifted to Clara, appraising her with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. "And who is this charming companion?" "This is Clara," Richard said, with a calmness that even surprised himself. "A very important person to me." Clara felt her cheeks flush but managed to hold her composure. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Beaumont," she said, her voice steadier than she had expected. Charles raised an eyebrow but smiled. "The pleasure is mine, my dear." "Well, Richard, you've always had a knack for surprises." The next few minutes were a blur of introductions and formalities. Clara felt like a fish out of water but did her best to keep up with the conversations, paying close attention to the details and making an effort to appear natural. Richard, meanwhile, performed his role with finesse, striking a balance between charm and professionalism. Once they were seated at the main table, Clara finally had a moment to breathe. The conversation flowed effortlessly around her, covering everything from corporate mergers to financial market trends. Despite her initial nervousness, Clara realized she was good at listening. Occasionally, She asked questions that surprised the other guests, in a good way, particularly Charles, who seemed increasingly intrigued by her. Richard noticed. He saw how Clara, in her simplicity, managed to draw attention in a way he hadn't anticipated. Her authenticity felt like a breath of fresh air amidst the pretense. "So, Clara," Charles asked during dessert, leaning slightly towards her, "what do you make of this world that Richard lives in?" Clara took a deep breath before answering. "It's impressive," she said, choosing her words carefully. "But it also seems lonely." The room fell momentarily silent, and Richard felt his heart skip a beat. Charles, however, let out a deep, genuine laugh. "Well said," he remarked, giving Richard a light pat on the shoulder. "You should listen to her more, my friend." As the evening wore on, while Clara still drew curious glances, the initial discomfort had given way to something else entirely. She began to feel, in some small way, that she was proving to herself that she could belong anywhere she chose to be. Meanwhile, Richard, watching Clara offer a shy smile to another guest, felt a deeply unsettling realization. He had brought Clara to fill a void in his life, but in doing so, he was beginning to understand that the true emptiness lay within himself. As the main courses were served, the dinner settled into an almost deafening rhythm of formality. Clara was slowly finding her footing, though she remained cautious with every gesture. Charles Beaumont continued to observe her, intrigued, like a man trying to solve a puzzle. "So, Richard," Charles began, setting his fork aside, "I've heard rumors about your latest acquisition. It seems it hasn't been received too warmly by the market." Richard's gaze hardened slightly, though his tone remained steady. "Every strategic move takes time to mature, Charles. I'm confident the results will come." Before Charles could reply, a sharp voice cut through the conversation. "Confident? Perhaps you should tread more carefully, Hayes. Confidence has been the downfall of many great men." The voice belonged to Howard Grayson, a fierce competitor of Richard's who, until then, had kept to himself that evening. His sudden approach to the table was as abrupt as the provocation. Richard turned slowly, his jaw muscles tightening. "Grayson, always so candid. And always so interested in my business." "I'd say it's the other way around, Hayes," Grayson replied, pouring himself a glass of wine with the ease of someone who felt completely at home. "I merely observe. And from what I've observed, you've been making some rather impulsive decisions, like tonight's dinner, for example." Grayson's gaze shifted pointedly to Clara, and the atmosphere grew heavy. Clara felt her cheeks flush. His words were polished enough to avoid overt rudeness, but the implication was clear. What was she doing there? "Clara," Grayson said, ignoring Richard entirely, "may I ask what line of work you're in?" Before Clara could answer, Richard interjected, his tone low and razor-sharp. "Grayson, I wasn't aware your interest in my guests was so fervent." Grayson smiled, clearly pleased with himself for provoking a reaction. "Just curiosity, Hayes. After all, authenticity is such a rare commodity in these circles." But Clara didn't remain silent. She raised her eyes and replied with unexpected composure. "I work for Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice calm yet firm. "And I believe authenticity isn't about where you are, but who you are." A subtle murmur rippled through the table. Grayson seemed ready to respond, but Charles, who had been watching with an amused glint in his eyes, intervened. "Well said, Clara," Charles declared, raising his glass in an impromptu toast. "Authenticity is a privilege few of us ever get to witness." Richard turned to Clara, startled by her bravery. In that moment, he realized her presence had brought something his past interactions had always lacked: honesty. But the matter wasn't settled. Grayson, displeased with losing control of the situation, leaned forward slightly, his tone laced with sarcasm. "Tell me, Clara, what do you think of Mr. Hayes' business decisions? Surely someone like you must have a unique perspective." Clara took a deep breath. Richard began to open his mouth to intervene, but she was quicker. "I think Mr. Hayes makes tough decisions," she said, locking eyes with Grayson. "And like anyone building something great, he learns from them. It's not easy being in his position." For a moment, there was silence. Grayson looked ready to press further, but this time, Charles interrupted once more, his voice steady but commanding. "Grayson, my dear," Charles interjected, his voice a touch firmer than before. "I believe you've had your fun for one evening. Why don't we let the rest of us enjoy dessert in peace?" Grayson's smile faltered, and without another word, he returned to his seat. As the dinner went on, Richard felt a surge of gratitude, and something deeper, towards Clara. She hadn't just stood up to Grayson with grace and intelligence, she had also defended him, something he hadn't expected. When the evening finally drew to a close and the guests began to leave, Richard and Clara walked side by side towards the exit. "You didn't have to say that," Richard murmured, his voice softer than usual. Clara glanced at him, surprised. "And let them speak badly of you? No, Mr. Hayes. You deserve more respect than that." Richard didn't respond right away, but for the first time in what felt like years, he experienced a genuine sense of admiration. The night air had turned crisp as Richard and Clara stepped out of the restaurant. A light breeze played with her hair, and the silence between them felt more comfortable than awkward. Richard seemed lost in thought, while Clara tried to process the intensity of the evening. Suddenly, Richard stopped beside the waiting car and turned to her. "Do you like ice cream?" The question was so unexpected that she almost laughed. "Ice cream? Now?" He gave a faint smile, something rare on his face. "Yes, now. Come on." Without waiting for her answer, he waved the driver off. "We won't need you for a while. We'll walk." Clara hesitated for a moment but decided to follow him. They strolled through the quiet streets of London, their footsteps echoing softly between the buildings. Richard seemed less formal, as though something inside him had shifted after the evening's events. A few minutes later, they came across a small ice cream shop still open, its warm lights glowing against the cool night. Richard entered without hesitation, like a regular, and ordered 2 ice creams, handing one to Clara. "Vanilla," he said, as if explaining his choice. "Nothing fancy, but it's my favorite." Clara smiled as she accepted it. "Vanilla's perfect." They found a bench nearby, overlooking the Thames. The dark waters mirrored the city's lights, casting a serene glow. For a while, they ate in silence, though it was clear Richard had something on his mind. "Thank you for bringing me tonight," Clara said, breaking the quiet. "I don't know if I was much help, but—" "You were more than you realize," he interrupted softly, his gaze fixed on the river. "Tonight, at dinner, you said you thought my world was lonely." Clara froze, caught off guard. "I said it because it's what I felt. I'm sorry if I was." "No," he cut her off again, this time looking directly at her. "You were right." She didn't respond immediately, sensing he wasn't finished. "I've spent so much time trying to build something unshakable, untouchable," he continued, turning the ice cream cup in his hands. "But in the process, I lost sight of what really matters. Tonight, seeing you there, among all those people, it reminded me of something I'd forgotten. Honesty. Simplicity. Clara studied his face, trying to understand the depth of what he was saying. And is that a bad thing? Richard let out a short, humorless laugh. No. Quite the opposite. It's exactly what I needed. She looked down, stirring her ice cream with the spoon. Mr. Hayes. Richard, he corrected gently. Richard, she continued, hesitating. I just tried to be myself tonight. I didn't know if it was the right thing to do, but I figured the least I could be was honest. I'm not good at pretending. He nodded, as though her words carried a weight he understood all too well. And that's exactly what's missing in this world. I wonder, he trailed off, as if carefully choosing his words. I wonder how my life might have turned out if I'd learned to be more like you. Clara felt a wave of emotion rise in her, but before she could respond, Richard turned to her with a tired smile. But that doesn't matter now. What matters is that you were there. And you helped me see something I'd forgotten. They sat in silence for a few moments longer, the cold air mingling with the sweet scent of ice cream. Yet, even in that quiet, it felt like a lot was being said. Richard finished the last bite of his ice cream and looked out at the horizon, where the city lights faded into the darkness of the Thames. He took a deep breath, as if trying to summon the courage to say something that had been buried within him for far too long. You know what's funny? He finally broke the silence, his voice tinged with irony. Clara turned to him, curious. What? All this theater I put on, he said, gesturing with his hands. The grand meetings, the perfect suits, the rehearsed lines. And tonight, I realized none of it actually matters. He let out a laugh, but it was laced with bitterness. I'm a fool, Clara. A complete fool. She stared at him, surprised by his honesty. Why do you say that? Richard ran his hands over his face, as if trying to wipe away an invisible weight. Because tonight, sitting at that dinner, surrounded by people I've spent my whole life trying to impress, I realized something: I don't belong in that world. Not as I am. And all this effort to appear. Right? He shook his head, frustrated. It's all nonsense. Clara leaned forward slightly, her gaze locked on his. But you're respected, admired. Everything you've built. It's not nonsense, Richard. He looked at her directly, and his tired eyes revealed a vulnerability Clara had never seen before. But at what cost, Clara? I've spent years trying to be the man they expected me to be. And in doing so, I've forgotten who I really am. He paused, his voice dropping to a whisper. If I ever even knew. Clara felt a lump in her throat, but before she could say anything, Richard continued. Do you know what makes me feel like the biggest idiot of all? He smiled, but it was a sad smile. With all the money, power, and status I've accumulated, you, with your honesty and authenticity, earned more respect tonight than I have in years. Her eyes widened. That's not true. They were there for you, Richard. I was just part of the evening. No, Clara. He shook his head firmly. You were the truth I've never had the courage to show. While I hid behind strategies and masks, you showed up and just were yourself. And do you know what happened? They noticed. Charles noticed. Even Grayson noticed. Clara remained silent, letting his words sink in. She had never seen Richard like this, so human, so full of doubts. I prepared so much for that dinner, Richard continued, his eyes returning to the river. The dress, the hairdresser, hours rehearsing what to say. And in the end, all we needed was honesty. Something I've never really known how to offer. He paused, exhaling deeply. I wonder, is it too late for me to learn? Clara smiled faintly, though her eyes were glassy with unshed tears. I think you've already started, Richard. He turned to her, surprised. Started? Yes, she said, her voice steady. By bringing me to that dinner, by letting me be who I am. That was an act of courage. It might not seem like much to you, but to me, it was. Richard fell silent for a moment, absorbing her words. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of hope, not in financial success or professional recognition, but in the possibility of rebuilding something within himself. Thank you, he said at last, for reminding me what really matters. Clara gave him a small smile, and the two returned their gaze to the river. The conversation seemed to have reached a natural pause, though not an ending. There was more to say, more to understand, for both Richard and Clara. The cold wind cut through the stillness as they remained seated on the bench. Clara had finished her ice cream, but still held the empty cup in her hands, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the rim. Richard, meanwhile, stared at the river, though his thoughts were far from the present moment. You know, Richard began, breaking the silence, I've always thought I needed to control everything. That to be successful, I had to be in charge all the time, leaving no room for mistakes or vulnerability. Clara tilted her head slightly, listening intently. He didn't seem to expect a response, but speaking out loud appeared to ease something within him. But deep down, I don't think I've ever really believed in myself, he continued, his voice softer now. That's why I hide behind numbers, contracts, and strategies. It's easier than admitting that maybe I don't even know who I am without all of this. Clara took a moment before responding, choosing her words carefully. I don't think anyone has all the answers about themselves, Richard. We're all trying to figure it out in our own way. But, don't you think it's harder when you're on your own? Her question hit him unexpectedly. He turned to her, his eyes meeting hers. On my own? Clara shrugged, a little hesitant. I see it in you. Even when you're surrounded by people, there's something lonely about you. Richard let out a quiet laugh, not mocking but thoughtful. You're not wrong. My life is a string of meetings, events, and dinners like tonight. But none of those people are really there for me. They're there for what I can offer. He paused, exhaling deeply. I've grown used to it. Even accepted it. But deep down, I think I've always felt something missing. Missing what? Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He hesitated for a moment before answering. Someone who sees me for who I am. Not Richard Hayes the businessman, but Richard Hayes the man. Clara felt a wave of empathy for him. Beneath all the power and poise was a man who simply wanted to be understood. I see you, Richard, she said simply. He looked up at her, surprised. You see me? Yes, she replied. I see someone who's worked hard, made mistakes, but still has so much to give. Not just to the world, but to himself. Her words echoed within him, stirring something he couldn't quite name. For the first time in years, he felt understood, not as a symbol of success, but as a human being. Thank you, Clara, he said, his voice full of sincerity. You've got more courage and wisdom than anyone I know. She laughed softly, embarrassed. Me? Courage? I could barely face that dinner without feeling completely out of place. And yet, you held your ground, he said with a genuine smile. Not only that, but you helped me see things in a way I never had before. Clara looked away, her cheeks coloring slightly. Well, I suppose it's the least I can do, considering everything you've done for me. Richard shook his head. No. Tonight, you did far more for me than I've ever done for you. Their conversation was interrupted by a gentle breeze carrying the faint sound of music from somewhere nearby. They lapsed into silence again, but this time it was comfortable, brimming with unspoken meaning. Clara, Richard said, breaking the quiet once more. If you could do anything right now, anything in the world, what would it be? She thought for a moment before answering. I think I'd travel. See the world. I've always wanted to, but I've never had the chance. Richard smiled, a newfound glint in his eyes. Maybe it's time to change that. Clara looked at him, puzzled, but before she could ask what he meant, Richard stood and offered his hand to help her up. Come on, he said. It's late. But I think this is just the beginning. She took his hand, still uncertain of what he was implying. Yet, as they walked back to the car, there was something in the air, a feeling that perhaps both of them were about to embark on something far greater than they had anticipated. The car dropped them off at Richard's house, the easy silence that had accompanied them lingering as they climbed the steps to the front door. Richard unlocked it and held it open for Clara to step inside first. Shall I make us a cup of tea before I head off? Clara offered, more to extend the conversation than out of obligation. Richard hesitated before replying. I'd like that. She disappeared into the kitchen while he settled on the sofa in the living room, loosening his tie. The house felt warmer than the chilly street outside, yet there was still an undeniable emptiness in the air, a hollowness he'd been trying to ignore for years. When Clara returned, balancing a tray with 2 porcelain cups and a small jug of milk, she found Richard leaning forward, his hands clasped in front of his face, lost in thought. Is something wrong? She asked, setting the tray down on the coffee table. He looked up, shaking his head slowly. No, quite the opposite, actually. I think, for the first time in a long while, something feels right. Clara sat across from him and handed him a cup. So, the dinner was a success. It was, he said, though his tone was distant. But not because of the business. It was because of something bigger. She tilted her head, intrigued. Something bigger? Richard took a sip of his tea before answering. Tonight, I realized how much I've lost trying to be what people expected me to be. I've spent years trying to fit in, trying to be perfect, but all of that only pushed me further away from what really matters. Clara listened intently, holding the warm cup between her hands. He was open, almost vulnerable, a side of him she never would have imagined when she first started working for him. And what matters, Richard? She asked softly. He placed his cup back on the table and looked at her directly. People. Real connections. Honesty. He paused, exhaling deeply. You reminded me of that tonight, Clara. You made me remember something I'd forgotten. She smiled gently, though there was a touch of sadness in her expression. I'm glad. But you already had it in you, Richard. You just needed a nudge. Richard chuckled quietly. You're far too generous. But I think I needed more than a nudge, I needed a reminder. A chance to start over. Clara averted her gaze, taking a small sip of tea. And what will you do now? The question lingered in the air for a few seconds as he seemed to weigh his answer. Finally, he spoke. I'm going to stop pretending. I'll try to be more honest with myself. And maybe start fixing the mistakes I've made. That's a good start, Clara said sincerely. And what about you? Richard asked, shifting the focus to her. What do you want, Clara? Truly? She hesitated. I've said before, I think I'd like to see the world. But honestly, I don't know if I even know how to do that. I've been so used to this life that I wouldn't know where to begin. Richard studied her, thoughtful. If you could choose, where would you start? She smiled shyly. I've always wanted to see Paris. I don't know why, but it seems like it would be magical. He smiled back but said nothing. There was something in his eyes, a decision forming, though he wasn't ready to share it just yet. As they finished their tea, the house felt less empty, as if their words had filled a space that had long been void. When Clara stood to leave, Richard walked her to the door. Clara, he said just as she was about to step outside. Yes? Thank you. For everything. She smiled, and for a moment, they stood there, silently looking at one another. Then she left, leaving Richard standing in the doorway, feeling as though something in his life was finally starting to change for the better. The next morning, Richard woke before dawn. The pale light of the rising sun seeped through his bedroom curtains, and he lay there for a few minutes, staring at the ceiling. Clara's words echoed in his mind, asterisk, I don't know if I even know how to do that. Asterisk. He understood that feeling all too well. For years, he had been trapped in a routine so rigid that the thought of change had seemed impossible. But now, something inside him had shifted. This time, he wouldn't let doubt hold him back. After a quick shower and a hasty coffee, Richard headed to his office and began sorting through papers and contracts. But instead of focusing on work as usual, he opened a notebook and began to write. The words flowed easily, as though the idea had been quietly brewing within him all along. Hours later, he called Clara. Good morning, Mr. Hayes, she answered on the other end of the line, her voice as polite as ever. Clara, he began, getting straight to the point, are you busy this afternoon? She hesitated, surprised. No, sir. Why? I need you to come over. There's something I'd like to discuss. Intrigued, Clara agreed and arrived at his house early that afternoon. When she stepped inside, she found Richard in unusually high spirits. He seemed almost excited, a stark contrast to the stern man she knew so well. Thanks for coming, he said, gesturing for her to sit down. Of course. Has something happened? She asked, curiosity etched on her face. Richard picked up an envelope from the table and handed it to her. Open it. Clara glanced at him, puzzled, but did as he asked. Inside was a train ticket to Paris and a folded map covered in handwritten notes. I don't understand, she said, looking back at him. You mentioned once that you'd always wanted to see Paris, Richard explained, leaning forward slightly. I thought it was time you did. Clara blinked, struggling to process the gesture. Mr. Hayes, this is... I can't accept this. Why not? He asked firmly. Because it's too much. I can't just leave. I have responsibilities, work. Richard shook his head. You've spent your whole life looking after everything and everyone. Maybe it's time you looked after yourself. Clara fell silent, holding the ticket as if it was something both precious and daunting. What about you? How will you manage without me here? He smiled, a calm and reassuring smile. I'll be fine. You've helped me see that I can start changing things, Clara. And that starts with you." Her eyes filled with tears, but she tried to keep her emotions in check. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll accept," he said gently. Clara finally nodded, a tentative smile forming on her lips. "Thank you for believing in me." Richard exhaled deeply, as though a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. "You taught me to believe in myself, Clara. This is the least I can do." They spent the afternoon discussing her plans for the trip, with Richard insisting she savor every moment without worrying about practicalities. For him, helping Clara was more than an act of gratitude, it was the first step in transforming his own life. When Clara left that evening, Richard stood at the doorway, watching her fade into the horizon. He knew that, no matter how difficult it was, letting Clara go was part of the process. Yet as he stepped back inside, he realized that, for the first time, the emptiness he used to feel wasn't there. Clara clutched the train ticket in her hands as the carriage glided smoothly along the tracks, cutting through postcard-perfect landscapes. The winter sky was bright, and sunlight streamed through the windows, casting a warm glow on her face. She still couldn't quite believe what was happening. Not only had Richard encouraged her to take the trip, but he had insisted on handling all the arrangements. Arriving at Gare du Nord, Clara was overwhelmed with a mix of excitement and nerves. The bustling streets of Paris enveloped her in a symphony of sounds, scents, and colors she had never experienced before. The French voices around her sounded like music, even if she could only catch fragments of their meaning. She wandered the streets, each step a reminder that she was finally living something she'd only dreamed of. The Eiffel Tower shimmered in the distance, and as Clara gazed at it, silent tears rolled down her cheeks. For the first time in a long while, she had chosen herself. Back in London, Richard stared at the same teacup Clara had served from before she left. The house felt quieter without her, but rather than feeling lonely, he felt hopeful. He spent the following days re-evaluating his own life, finally confronting the challenges he had avoided for so long. The first thing he did was draft an email to Charles Beaumont. "Charles, I just wanted to say thank you for the dinner. But more importantly, thank you for the perspective that evening gave me. I've decided it's time to make some changes in how I run my business and live my personal life. I hope that, in the future, we can have more honest and meaningful conversations." After sending the email, Richard felt a lightness he hadn't experienced in years. Clara, meanwhile, was continuing her adventure in Paris. She explored quaint bakeries, hidden museums, and peaceful parks where she'd spend hours reading and simply observing the world go by. One afternoon, while enjoying a coffee at a charming little corner cafe, she decided to write a letter to Richard. "Richard, Paris is everything I imagined, and so much more. Every street feels like it has a story, and every passerby carries a lifetime of mysteries. You've given me something I can never repay, the chance to discover the world and, in doing so, rediscover myself. I hope you're also exploring new horizons, even if in your own way. Perhaps one day you'll visit Paris, and I can show you all that I've learned. With gratitude, Clara." When Richard received the letter, he smiled. There was something comforting about knowing Clara was experiencing something so profound. Inspired by her, he decided to do something he'd put off for years: reconnect with his daughter, who had been living in another city since his divorce. That evening, as he began writing to her, Richard realized Clara hadn't just shown him the value of honesty but also the courage to act on it. Clara walked along the banks of the Seine at sunset, the sky awash with gold and orange hues reflecting on the calm waters. In her hand, she held a small notebook where she jotted down thoughts and feelings that arose during her travels. Since arriving, she had felt a mix of freedom and uncertainty, but slowly, the weight of the routine that had once defined her seemed to be lifting. That day, she decided to visit the Musée d'Orsay, which a friend from her hotel had recommended. Wandering among the Impressionist paintings, Clara stopped in front of one piece that caught her attention, a simple scene of farm workers in a field, with a vast sky overhead. The expressions on their faces were serene, yet their eyes held something that made her think about her own life, years spent caring for others while putting her own dreams aside. Suddenly, she felt a pull to return to London. Not out of regret, but because, for the first time, she felt she could go back as someone new, with the courage and purpose to make different choices. Meanwhile, Richard was packing his bag. He'd spent days exchanging emails with his daughter, Emily, and had finally arranged to meet her for the first time in over 3 years. The divorce had left deep scars between them, but now, as he headed to the car that would take him to the station, he felt more hope than fear. When he arrived at the cafe where they'd agreed to meet, Emily was already there. Her hair was tied back in a bun, and she was scrolling through her phone while absent-mindedly stirring her coffee with a spoon. "Emily," Richard called, his voice a little shakier than he'd expected. She looked up, her eyes cautious at first. But when she saw her father standing there, her expression softened. "Hi, Dad." The reunion was easier than he had imagined. Though there were moments of awkward silence, their mutual effort to rebuild their relationship was clear. Emily even laughed at some of the childhood stories Richard shared, and by the end, he promised this was just the start of something better. "Thank you for coming, Emily," he said as they parted ways. "I needed this too, Dad," she replied, her smile lighting up Richard's heart. That evening, Richard received another letter from Clara. She described how Paris had shifted her perspective, but also admitted she was beginning to miss home, not the routine that had once trapped her, but the feeling of belonging. Moved by her honesty, Richard sat down and began to write back. "Clara, your letter arrived at just the right time. Today, for the first time in years, I had lunch with my daughter. And do you know something? It was she who reminded me what it means to believe in second chances. You had the courage to embark on a journey of self-discovery, and that inspired me to do the same. When you return, I hope we can sit down and talk about everything we've learned, you about Paris, and me about the people I love. See you soon. Richard." As Clara read the letter, sitting at the small desk in her Paris room, she realized that Richard was changing. He was doing something he'd often neglected, putting people and feelings above everything else. Though separated by miles, they shared a quiet certainty. They were both ready to begin a new chapter in their lives. The train was slowing as Clara watched the familiar outskirts of London roll by through the window. The city looked different now, as though her perspective had shifted. During her time in Paris, she hadn't just discovered a new place but also rediscovered parts of herself that had been forgotten for years. As she stepped off the train, her suitcase light and her heart full, she felt a spark of excitement to see Richard again. Richard, meanwhile, had spent the last few days tidying up the house. He'd made sure everything was just so, though, for the first time, it wasn't about appearances. As he adjusted the position of a vase in the living room, he chuckled at himself. Why does this matter so much now? He wondered, though deep down, he knew the answer. Clara had become more than just an employee, she was a friend, someone he deeply admired. When Clara arrived at the door, Richard was already waiting. As he opened it, he smiled, a gesture that now felt more natural to him. "Welcome back." Clara smiled in return. "Thank you. It's good to be home." She stepped inside, and they settled in the living room. The conversation began lightly, with Clara sharing stories from her trip. Richard listened intently, asking about the places she'd been and the people she'd met. But after a while, the tone shifted. "Clara," he said, his voice more serious, "I need to thank you for something you may not even realize. Your journey, it gave me the courage to make some changes of my own." She tilted her head, curious. "What changes?" "I reconnected with my daughter," he said, pausing as if to choose his words carefully. "It was hard at first, but bit by bit, we're making up for lost time. And that only happened because you showed me it's never too late to try." Clara felt a wave of emotion. "I'm so happy to hear that, Richard. Truly." He smiled, but then his expression grew more thoughtful. "I've also realized something else. I spent so much time trapped in a bubble, focused on work and success, that I neglected the people around me. You, for instance. You've always been here, and I never stopped to appreciate just how much your presence matters." Clara was silent, caught off guard by his candor. "I want you to know," he continued, "that no matter what, you're free to follow your dreams. If you want to travel more, to explore other paths, I'll support you. But if you choose to stay, I hope we can build something new together, not as boss and employee, but as friends." Clara's eyes welled with tears, but she smiled. "Richard, you don't know how much that means to me. And yes, I want to stay. Not because I feel tied down here, but because, for the first time, I feel like I'm part of something that truly matters." They sat in silence for a few moments, letting the words settle. It was a kind of understanding that didn't require further explanation. In the months that followed, their lives transformed in ways they'd never thought possible. Clara began taking courses and pursuing activities she'd always dreamed of, while Richard dedicated more time to his daughter and the genuine connections in his life. The house, once cold and distant, became a space of warmth and mutual growth. A year later, on a sunny afternoon, Clara and Richard were sitting in the garden, laughing over something she'd shared about her French course classmates. Their friendship had grown into something as natural as the gentle breeze weaving through the trees. "Clara," Richard said, looking at her with a warm smile, "I think you've brought Paris to me." She laughed, a little puzzled. "What do you mean?" "You've brought color and life to something that was once just routine. And to me, that's more magical than any city in the world." Clara didn't reply right away, but she smiled, feeling that, somehow, they had both found exactly what they needed, a place where they could truly be themselves. If this story touched your heart, remember, we all have the chance to change our lives, find connection, and rediscover what truly matters. Just like Richard and Clara, you too can find the courage to explore new paths and build more authentic relationships. Share this story with someone who could use a bit of inspiration, and let us know in the comments what moved you the most. Let's talk about the lessons we can take from this. And don't forget to explore more stories like this. Subscribe to the channel, give the video a like, and turn on notifications so you don't miss out on anything new. See you next time.